There is a kind of embarrassment that is done loudly and without apology. It does not whisper. It does not wait for a private moment. It happens in front of people, in front of cameras, in front of a live studio audience, in front of the family you love. And it is delivered with the casual ease of someone who has never once considered that the person receiving it has a right not to. On a Wednesday afternoon in November 2023, that kind of embarrassment arrived on the Family Feud stage in the form of a man named Gerald Foster, who made a joke about his wife of 17 years that was not a joke at all. It was a verdict, delivered in public, dressed in laughter so that no one could easily object to it. His wife, Renata, did not object. She had learned over 17 years that objecting in the moment cost more than it recovered, and so she stood beside Gerald and smiled the smile that was not a smile, and she waited. Steve Harvey was not waiting. He had seen the joke land. He had seen Renata's face. And within 30 seconds of Gerald's punchline fading from the air, Steve Harvey had stepped in, not with the performative outrage that makes good television, but with the quiet, purposeful authority of a man who has decided that something true needs to be said, and he is the one in position to say it. What he said changed the afternoon for Renata Foster entirely. And for a great many people watching from home, it changed something else, something harder to name but more lasting. It reminded them what it looks like when a person in power chooses, without hesitation, to use it for someone who needs it. This is that story. If you believe that dignity is not optional, that it belongs to every person in every room, especially the ones with cameras, hit like and subscribe right now. This is exactly why we are here. Renata Foster was 47 years old, and she was the kind of woman whose quality becomes apparent slowly and then completely, the kind you do not immediately identify as extraordinary because she does not require you to. She was not a woman who announced herself. She was a woman who showed up and kept showing up with a consistency that revealed itself to be extraordinary only when you thought about what that consistency had cost and what it had built over time. She had grown up in Columbus, Ohio, the middle child of a Dominican-American father and a Black American mother who had met at a manufacturing company where both worked, married within a year of meeting, and spent the next 3 decades building a household defined by its stability rather than its resources. Her father, Ernesto, had been a maintenance supervisor, meticulous, unhurried, a man who believed that doing something correctly the first time was not perfectionism but basic respect for the materials and the people who would depend on the result. Her mother, Cynthia, had worked as a licensed practical nurse for 28 years and had the particular quality of nurses who have seen enough human difficulty to have permanently organized their priorities around what actually matters. Renata had absorbed both of them. From her father, she had inherited a rigorous attention to craft. From her mother, she had taken a deep and practical understanding that people are more important than appearances, and that the most important things are usually not the most visible ones. She had studied graphic design at Ohio State, worked for several years at a design agency in Columbus, and at 33 had made the transition to freelance work when it became clear that the agency model rewarded speed over care in a ratio she found professionally untenable. The freelance practice had grown slowly and then steadily, and by the time of the taping she had built a client base that included several regional nonprofits, 2 small publishing houses, and a growing number of small business owners who had found her through word of mouth. The particular recommendation network of people who have had work done correctly and want their friends to have the same experience. She was good at her work in the specific way of people who are good at things that require both technical skill and human understanding, who can solve a visual problem and simultaneously read what the client actually needs, which is frequently not what they have asked for. Her clients trusted her. Several had worked with her for more than a decade. One nonprofit director, when asked to describe Renata for a professional reference, had said simply, "She makes us look like what we aspire to be, which is the most useful thing a designer can do." She had met Gerald Foster at a Columbus networking event in 2006. He was 34, a regional sales manager for a consumer goods distributor, and he possessed the easy, forward confidence of a man who has been told his whole life that he is charming, which he was, in a manner that was genuinely attractive in small doses and somewhat more complicated in larger ones. He had pursued Renata with consistency and evident sincerity. He had made her laugh. He had told her early on that she was the most composed person he had ever met and that he meant it as the highest compliment. She had taken it as such. They had married in 2006. Their son, Andre, was now 20 and studying business administration at Columbus State. Their daughter, Maya, was 17 and had her mother's quality of careful attention and her father's facility with people, a combination that made her, in Renata's quiet assessment, better equipped for the world than either of her parents had been at that age. Both were on the Family Feud team. Gerald's older sister, Phyllis, completed the team. She was 54, a high school history teacher in Columbus, and a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable loyalty to her brother, though the loyalty was not, it should be said, unconditional. Phyllis had opinions. She expressed them to Gerald directly and in private, which was the correct way to express them, and she kept them there, which was the mark of a woman who understood the distinction between honesty and interference. The Family Feud application had been Andre's idea, submitted 6 months earlier as a Mother's Day gift with the specific appeal that it was something the whole family could do together. Renata had been touched by the intention and genuinely enthusiastic about the occasion. She had not been enthusiastic about everything that surrounded the occasion. Specifically, she had been less than fully at ease with the knowledge that Gerald, who had a well-established habit of deploying humor at her expense in social situations, and who regarded this habit as entirely affectionate, would be performing in front of a national audience for whom his comedic instincts were entirely untested. She had said something to this effect, briefly and carefully, the night before the taping. Gerald had told her she worried too much, that it would be fun, that he knew how to read a room. He did not, on this particular afternoon, read the room correctly. Steve Harvey, conducting his pre-show walkthrough, had spent a few minutes with Renata discussing her design practice. She had described her work with the same composed, specific enthusiasm she brought to everything, the pleasure of making something clear that was previously confusing, the satisfaction of finding the visual language that allowed a small organization to communicate its actual value to the people it was trying to reach. Steve had listened with the genuine interest he reserves for people whose work he respects, and had said that what she was describing sounded like a form of translation. Renata had said that was exactly what it was, and that most of the time the real work was learning what actually needed to be said before you could decide how to say it. Steve had nodded at that and held it, the way he holds things he intends to return to. He had noted Gerald beside her, warm, social, taking up space in the easy way of a man entirely comfortable in his own performance. And he had noted the very slight, practiced adjustment Renata made each time Gerald spoke, the micro-calibration of a woman who has learned to position herself relative to her husband's energy with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been doing it for a long time. He filed it. He always filed these things. He had learned, across thousands of hours of pre-show conversations, that what you notice in the first 10 minutes is almost always what matters by the time the cameras have been running for an hour. The Foster family drew the Mwangi family from Minneapolis as their opponents, a 4-person team anchored by a 57-year-old Kenyan-American retired nurse named Wanjiru, who approached the game with the calm authority of someone who has spent her career making critical decisions under pressure, and who regarded a game show buzzer as considerably less demanding than the average Tuesday on a pediatric ward. Her daughter and son-in-law completed the team along with her teenage granddaughter, who had the specific quality of a 17-year-old who is very aware that she is on television and has decided this is going to go well. The Fosters were immediately engaging. Andre had his father's social ease and his mother's precision, which made him an unusually effective game show contestant. He could read the room and read the survey simultaneously, which is rarer than it sounds. Maya played with the observant accuracy of someone who had spent her life paying close attention to the people around her. Phyllis was strategic and deliberate. Renata was composed and correct, stepping to the buzzer with the unhurried confidence of a woman who trusts her own judgment and does not require the audience's approval before she exercises it. Gerald was, from the first minute, the loudest and most energized member of his team. He buzzed first on nearly every question in the opening round. He celebrated correct answers with the wholehearted enthusiasm of a man who is genuinely enjoying himself, which was infectious, and which Steve played off easily. He and Steve established an immediate rapport, the back and forth of two naturally performative people who recognize in each other a similar comfort with the front of a room. The first moment arrived in the opening round. Steve asked the family to introduce themselves briefly, and Gerald, speaking for the group with the ease of a man who has always assumed the spokesperson role, described Renata's work as artsy stuff for companies that can't afford real advertising. He laughed. Several people in the audience laughed. Renata smiled the practiced smile. Steve looked at her for a half-second. Then he moved the game forward. The second moment arrived during a sidebar conversation Steve had with the family between rounds, the kind of informal exchange he uses to give the audience texture. He asked Renata directly about her most interesting recent project. She began to describe a rebranding campaign for a community health nonprofit, a genuinely complex piece of work that had required her to develop a visual language that could communicate across 3 distinct audience segments while maintaining a unified identity. She was 2 sentences in when Gerald said, with the grin of a man who considers himself her best advocate, "In English, she draws logos for good causes. She's very talented." He said the last 3 words with the inflection of a man complimenting a child's finger painting. The audience produced a laugh that was shorter and less certain than the first one. Phyllis, standing beside her brother, looked at the ceiling briefly. Andre looked at his sneakers. Maya did not look at anything in particular, which was its own response. Renata stopped speaking. She did not finish the description of the project. She returned the smile to her face and allowed the moment to move on. Steve's expression had changed in the way it changes when he has seen enough to understand the pattern and is now deciding when to address it. He did not address it immediately. He was not yet at the moment, but he was moving toward it with the patient deliberateness of a man who knows where he is going and is in no hurry to arrive before the time is right. The third moment arrived in the second round, and it was the one that ended the deliberation. Steve had asked the family a question about what people are most proud of in their professional lives. Renata had been about to answer. She had stepped slightly forward with the specific quality of someone who has something genuine to say and is ready to say it, when Gerald buzzed ahead of her and said, "She'd say her designs. I'd say her cooking. Ask me which one keeps me coming back." The audience produced a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a silence, but something suspended between them, the collective holding of breath that a room does when it is deciding whether what just happened was funny or something else. Renata stepped back from the buzzer. She clasped her hands in front of her. She looked at a point slightly above the board with the expression of a woman who has received this particular kind of diminishment in public enough times to have built an architecture of composure around it, and who is currently residing inside that architecture and who is very tired. Steve Harvey looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned to face Gerald directly. "Hold on," he said. "We need to stop here." Steve Harvey crossed the stage with the unhurried deliberateness that the audience had come to understand. Across 2 rounds and 3 incidents was not his performance walk but his other walk. The one that means he has something specific to say and has decided to stand close to the person he is saying it to. He stopped in front of Gerald, not beside him, in front of him. "I'm going to ask you something," Steve said, "and I want you to think about it before you answer. Actually think about it." Gerald's grin had adjusted slightly. He was still performing, but the performance had become less comfortable. "Go ahead," he said. "How would you describe what your wife does for a living? Not the funny version, the real version. Take your time." Gerald looked at Renata, then back at Steve. The grin faded by another degree. "She's a graphic designer. She runs her own freelance practice. She's been doing it for, I don't know, 12, 14 years. 14 years, Steve said. He turned to Renata. "How many clients do you currently have?" "Regularly active. About 23, she said. 23 clients, Steve said, returning to Gerald, who found her how exactly, Renata answered before Gerald could. "Word of mouth mostly. I've never advertised." Steve nodded slowly. He let the implication of that sit in the room for a moment. 23 clients, 14 years, no advertising, before he continued. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said to Gerald. "Your wife has built a 14-year business through the quality of her work alone, with 23 clients who sought her out and kept coming back without ever spending a dollar to attract them. And you have described that work tonight as artsy stuff, as drawing logos, and as less impressive than her cooking." He paused. "I need you to hear what you have been doing." The audience was completely still. "You have been standing next to your wife for the past hour and using this stage to make sure that every time she started to tell her own story, the story got smaller. Every time she was about to be seen as what she actually is, a skilled professional who has built something real through her own effort and her own quality, you stepped in front of it with a joke that made it smaller. 3 times. I counted." Gerald's face had moved through its remaining performance and arrived at the expression underneath it, not defensive, not hostile, but the quieter, more uncomfortable expression of a man who has just been shown something about himself that he cannot argue with because it was done in front of 200 witnesses. "I don't think you are doing this to hurt her," Steve continued, and the acknowledgement was genuine rather than diplomatic. I think you are being funny. I think you think she knows you're proud of her, so the jokes don't actually mean anything. But here is what I have learned, and I have had to learn this the hard way, so I am saying this as someone who has made the same mistake and paid the price for it. When you consistently make the person you love smaller in public, the size of that person's world gets smaller. Not because they believe your jokes, because they start to believe that being made small in public is simply part of being with you. And then one day they stop finishing their sentences, not because they have nothing to say, because they have learned that you will finish it for them in a way that takes the substance out of it, and that is a loss for both of you. The studio held the particular silence that large spaces hold when something has been said that is too true to immediately respond to. Steve turned to Renata. I want to hear the rest of what you were saying about that project, the health nonprofit. You were describing a rebranding campaign. You said you had to develop a visual language across 3 audience segments. What happened? Renata looked at him. She was, for just a moment, visibly uncertain, the uncertainty of someone who has been interrupted so many times in one afternoon that she has lost easy access to the beginning of the sentence. Then she found it, and she talked. She described the project with the specific, grounded enthusiasm of someone who finds genuine pleasure in the complexity of their work. She talked about the research phase, and the discovery that the 3 audience segments had almost no visual language in common, and the solution she had arrived at, a system of visual elements that could be reconfigured for each context, while maintaining a coherent identity across all of them. She talked about the moment the client saw the final presentation and said quietly that she had been trying to explain who they were for 11 years, and this was the first time she had felt that the explanation was complete. She talked for 4 minutes. No one interrupted her. Not Gerald, not the game, not the audience. The room gave her 4 uninterrupted minutes, which was not a long time in absolute terms and was a very long time relative to what she had been given for the preceding hour. When she finished, Steve looked at the audience and then at Gerald. That, he said simply, is what your wife does. Gerald was looking at Renata. His expression had completed its journey from performance through discomfort and had arrived somewhere more honest and more private, the expression of a man who has been given a mirror and is looking into it with the specific, uncomfortable attention of someone who does not entirely like what he sees but has enough character to keep looking. Renata, he said. He stopped, tried again. I didn't. He stopped again. He looked at Steve. I've been doing that for a while, haven't I? It was not a question. Steve did not answer it. He simply held Gerald's gaze with the patient, unblinking steadiness of a man who is not going to rescue someone from a realization they need to complete on their own. After a moment, Gerald turned back to his wife. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry. Renata looked at him for a long moment. The architecture of composure was still in place, but something behind it had eased, almost imperceptibly. The specific easing of a person who has been heard, finally, in the place where the wound actually is. I know, she said, and the 2 words contain 17 years of the specific, complicated, still-present love of 2 people who are not where they need to be but have just, possibly, located the direction. Maya, standing behind her mother, took one quiet step forward and placed her hand, briefly, between Renata's shoulder blades. It was a small gesture, it was everything. Steve Harvey watched all of it. He did not speak. He understood that the moment had moved past the stage and into the family, and that the family was doing what it needed to do, and that his role was now simply to be present while it happened. After a suitable moment, he turned back to the room. Ladies and gentlemen, he said in the warm, concluding register of a man who is ready to bring something back to earth from the height it has reached, I think we just witnessed something a lot more valuable than a game show, and I think this family would probably like to finish what they came here to do. He looked at Renata. She nodded. The game resumed. The Foster family finished the game. They won the main round by a margin of 11 points over the Mwangi family, who accepted the result with the grace of a team led by a woman who had been losing gracefully and winning gracefully for 57 years, and saw no reason to make a distinction between the 2. Wanjiru shook Renata's hand after the final tally and told her she had conducted herself beautifully, which was both an accurate observation and a generous one, and Renata thanked her with the quiet sincerity the comment deserved. They did not advance past fast money. Andre and Renata together scored well. Renata's 4 answers were all correct and 3 were top-ranked. But the 5th answer, Andre's, landed outside the survey, and the total fell 11 points short of the prize. The audience groaned in the sympathetic, affectionate way that means they were rooting for the family rather than the outcome. And the groan itself was a form of acknowledgement that the afternoon had given the Fosters something worth more than $20,000, even if it had not given them the $20,000. After the taping, The production team noted that the family spent approximately an hour in the building after the cameras stopped. Phyllis, who had been managing a great deal of private feeling for the preceding 2 hours, found her brother in the corridor and had a conversation with him that she described afterward to the one friend she told about it, as the conversation she had been waiting to have for several years and had not known how to start. She said that the afternoon had started it for her. She said she was grateful for that, in the complicated way you are grateful for things that are also uncomfortable. Steve found Renata as had become his practice in these moments before she left. He asked how she was doing. She said she was processing. He said that was the correct response. She said she had not expected the afternoon to go the way it had gone, and that she was not certain yet whether that was a good thing or a complicated thing. Steve said from his own experience that it was usually both simultaneously, and that the complicated part was often what made the good part last. Renata said she thought that was probably right. He said she was an exceptional designer and an exceptional person, and that her husband was a fortunate man who had today received some information that he needed, and that what he did with it was the next chapter. She thanked him. She meant it. The clip was released 4 weeks after the taping, with the full consent of all parties. It ran 7 minutes and 20 seconds, the longest clip the show had released from a single episode in that calendar. The production team had structured it carefully, beginning with Gerald's first comment in the opening round and building chronologically to Steve's 4-minute gift of uninterrupted time to Renata, which the editing correctly identified as the emotional and moral center of the segment. The clip was viewed 21 million times in the first 6 days. Its pattern of distribution was distinctive. It moved heavily through professional networks, specifically through the networks of freelancers, small business owners, and creative professionals who recognized in Renata's situation the specific, familiar experience of having work that is genuinely skilled and genuinely difficult described by the person who is supposed to know it best, in terms that hollowed out its substance. The comments from this community were numerous and specific, people describing the precise deflation of watching their own professional identity reduced to a punchline by a partner who meant well and did not understand what they were doing. Several people wrote that watching Steve Harvey refuse to let the reduction stand was, for reasons they found difficult to fully articulate, one of the most professionally validating things they had ever seen on television. From a broader audience, the response focused on the pattern rather than the individual incidents. Steve had named it specifically 3 times, I counted, and that naming, that quantification, had resonated with people who recognized in their own relationships the specific experience of a recurring diminishment that is too small, in any individual instance, to confront, but that accumulates over time into something that changes the shape of a person's willingness to speak. Several therapists and relationship counselors shared the clip in the context of discussions about a phenomenon they variously called micro-invalidation or conversational erasure, the habitual minimization of a partner's identity and accomplishments in social settings. Several noted that Steve had articulated the mechanism and the consequence of this pattern with a precision and clarity that was difficult to achieve in a clinical setting, and that the fact of it happening on national television gave it a public legibility that private conversations often could not. Renata gave one interview to a podcast focused on women in the creative and design industries, approximately 4 months after the episode aired. She was measured and thoughtful in the way that had characterized everything she had said on the stage. She talked about her work with the same specific, grounded enthusiasm she had brought to the 4-minute description that had become the clip's emotional center. She talked about the clients she was currently working with and the projects that were interesting her most. She did not address the marriage in direct terms, and the interviewer, who had the intelligence to understand that some things are not hers to ask for, did not press. What Renata did say, toward the end of the conversation, when the interviewer asked what the experience had given her, was this: I think I had stopped expecting to be taken seriously in certain rooms. Not in professional rooms, my clients take me seriously, and that has always been enough to sustain me professionally. But in the rooms where the people who love you are also present, I had adjusted my expectations in those rooms without fully knowing I had done it. What happened that afternoon readjusted them. Not perfectly, not overnight, not without a great deal of subsequent conversation that I will keep private, but something shifted. And I think the thing that shifted was that I stopped accepting that finishing my own sentence was a luxury. It is not a luxury. It is the minimum. She paused. Steve Harvey gave me 4 minutes on national television to finish a sentence. That should not have been remarkable. The fact that it was remarkable is the thing I have been thinking about ever since. Gerald gave no public statement. What is known from the account Renata offered in her interview is that the conversation that began on the stage continued at home, and continued after that. With the assistance of a couple's therapist, they began seeing 6 weeks after the episode aired. The practice of beginning that therapy was Gerald's suggestion, which Renata described not as a resolution, but as an indication of the direction, a distinction that she held with the careful, honest precision she applied to everything that mattered to her. Andre, home from Columbus State for a weekend visit 2 months after the taping, described the household as different in a way he could not fully specify. He said his mother seemed to take up more space, which he had not been able to say before and which he was not sure she had been taking up before. He said his father listened differently, not perfectly, not without the old habits making occasional appearances, but with a more visible effort to catch himself when they did. He said it felt like work in progress, which he thought was probably what most good things felt like. Maya, who had placed her hand between her mother's shoulder blades at the moment it was needed, and had not discussed the gesture with anyone because it had not required discussion, enrolled in a graphic design elective her final semester of high school. She told her mother it was partly because of the description on the stage, the visual language across 3 audience segments, the system of reconfigurable elements. The moment the client said she finally felt explained. She said it sounded like the kind of work that required you to listen before you could do anything else. Renata said that was exactly right. Maya said she thought she might be good at that. Renata said she thought so too. Steve Harvey addressed the episode at a speaking engagement that spring as part of a longer conversation about what he had learned from 20 years of hosting family programming. He said that the Foster episode had reminded him of something he considered foundational to his understanding of what the show was actually for. People come on Family Feud for a lot of different reasons, he said. They want to win money. They want to be on television. They want to do something together as a family. All of those are real reasons and all of them are legitimate. But sometimes something else is also present. Sometimes a family comes on this show and what they actually need is a room where the truth gets said, not the private kitchen table truth that never quite gets finished. The out loud, witnessed, publicly acknowledged truth. And sometimes my job is not to host a game show. It is to be the person in that room who says, I see what is happening here and I am going to name it because it deserves to be named. He paused. Renata Foster is a very good designer who had her work described as artsy stuff 3 times in 1 hour by the person who knows her best. That is not a small thing. It accumulates. And the only thing I did was refuse to let it accumulate one more time in my presence. That is not heroic. That is the bare minimum of what a decent person does when they are in the room. I just happened to be the one in the room with the microphone. Renata Foster's design practice took on a new client in the month following the episode's release, a regional arts organization that had seen the clip and whose executive director had sought her out specifically, having described Renata's 4-minute explanation of her work as the most compelling creative brief she had ever heard. The project was the largest single commission Renata had undertaken in 14 years of practice. It was completed on time. The executive director told 3 colleagues about it, each of whom reached out to Renata in the months that followed. She finished every sentence. There is a category of harm that does not announce itself as harm. It arrives as humor. It arrives as affection. It arrives dressed in the confidence of a person who loves you and therefore believes that what they say about you is ultimately harmless, that you know what they mean, that the joke is beside the point, that the substance of who you are is secure enough that a little public reduction cannot touch it. But it does touch it. Not immediately. Not in any single incident that can be isolated and pointed to as the wound. It touches it in the accumulation, in the long, slow architecture of a person who has learned that being made small in public is simply the condition of being present alongside the person they love, and who has, without meaning to, stopped filling the full space that is rightfully theirs. Steve Harvey stepped into that architecture on a Wednesday afternoon in November and said, "No, not the funny version, the real version, not a joke about cooking. The actual account of what this woman has built and how she built it and what it is worth." And then he gave her 4 minutes, 4 uninterrupted minutes, which is not a long time and which was everything, to finish her own sentence in front of 200 people who were listening. Renata Foster finished her sentence, and then she went home and she kept finishing them, one by one, in the rooms where it mattered most. That is what this channel is for, not the dramatic moments, the real ones. The ones where dignity is quietly at stake and someone with a microphone decides to use it correctly. If this story gave you language for something you have been living with, if it reminded you that finishing your own sentence is not a luxury, please take 1 second and hit the like button. It helps more people find stories that deserve to be found. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one arrives. These are the stories that last. We find them every week. We will see you soon.